I still remember the exact moment I realized how easily people can influence each other without saying anything obvious. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was standing in line at a coffee shop before work, half awake, scrolling through my phone. A man stepped in behind me, looked around, and within seconds, the mood of the entire line seemed to change. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. Yet somehow, people began behaving differently. At the time, I couldn't explain it. But that small moment started an obsession that changed how I understood human behavior forever. A few years ago, I believed people made decisions logically. If someone liked you, it was because of who you were. If someone trusted you, it was because you earned it. If someone disagreed with you, it was because they genuinely saw things differently. Simple. At least that's what I thought. Back then, I worked in a mid-sized marketing office in Chicago. Nothing exciting. Just meetings, deadlines, emails, and the same familiar faces every day. One of those faces belonged to a coworker named Daniel. Daniel wasn't the smartest person in the office. He wasn't the funniest. He wasn't the most experienced. Yet somehow, people listened to him. When Daniel made a suggestion during meetings, heads nodded. When Daniel asked for help, people volunteered. When Daniel disagreed with someone, nobody seemed offended. I couldn't understand it. I remember sitting in conference rooms wondering what I was missing. Sometimes I had better ideas. Sometimes I had stronger arguments. Yet Daniel always seemed to have more influence. At first, I assumed it was confidence. Then I assumed it was charisma. But after watching him closely for months, I realized something strange. Daniel wasn't controlling conversations. He was controlling perceptions. And that distinction changed everything. The first trick I noticed was silence. Most people rushed to fill empty space. Daniel didn't. Whenever someone challenged him, he paused. Not dramatically. Not awkwardly. Just long enough. The silence made people uncomfortable. And because people naturally dislike uncertainty, they often started explaining themselves further. The more they talked, the more information Daniel gained. I remember thinking how strange it was. The person speaking less was somehow learning more. The second trick appeared during team discussions. Daniel rarely disagreed directly. Instead, he'd say something like, "That's interesting. What led you to that conclusion?" It sounded harmless. But psychologically, it shifted the burden of explanation. People suddenly had to justify their thinking. Sometimes they discovered flaws in their own reasoning before Daniel even responded. He wasn't winning arguments. He was letting people examine themselves. The third trick took me longer to notice. People naturally trust those who make them feel understood. Daniel had a habit of repeating parts of what others said. Not copying. Not mocking. Just reflecting. If someone said they felt overwhelmed, he'd respond, "So you're dealing with a lot at once." If someone expressed frustration, he'd acknowledge it before offering advice. Something fascinating happened. People relaxed. Their defenses lowered. They felt seen. And once people feel understood, they become far more open to influence. I started experimenting with this myself. Nothing manipulative. Just listening more carefully. The results surprised me. Conversations became smoother. Conflicts became smaller. People seemed more willing to collaborate. Not because I changed their minds. Because I first showed I understood them. Then came the fourth trick. Expectation. One afternoon, our manager introduced a new employee. Before she arrived, he spent several minutes describing how talented and organized she was. When she finally joined the team, everyone treated her like a high performer from day one. They interpreted her actions through that lens. Mistakes became exceptions. Successes became proof. That's when I discovered something uncomfortable. People often see what they expect to see. Perception isn't always objective. It's filtered. And expectations can quietly shape reality. The fifth trick revealed itself outside work. I was having dinner with an old friend when he told me a story about negotiating salaries. He said something I never forgot. The first number usually controls the conversation. At first, I doubted it. Then I researched the psychology behind it. The concept is called anchoring. The first piece of information people receive often influences everything that follows. A high price makes the next price seem reasonable. A low expectation makes average performance seem impressive. The anchor isn't always correct, but it affects judgment. Once I understood this, I started noticing anchors everywhere. Advertisements, conversations, news stories, even personal relationships. People constantly frame perceptions before decisions are made. The sixth trick arrived unexpectedly. One evening, I attended a networking event. I hated networking. Everyone seemed to be trying too hard. But one woman stood out. She barely talked about herself. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions. People loved speaking with her. Hours later, I realized something important. Most people are trying to be interesting. Very few focus on being interested. And that's powerful. When people feel valued, they naturally remember you more positively. The woman wasn't dominating conversations. She was creating experiences. That realization changed how I approached people. The final trick was perhaps the most important. And it came from a mistake. A major one. I was working on a project with another department. One of the team members consistently missed deadlines. I quickly labeled him irresponsible. Every interaction afterward reinforced my assumption. Late response? Irresponsible. Forgot a detail? Irresponsible. Delayed update? Irresponsible. Then one afternoon, I learned something. His wife had been undergoing intensive medical treatment for months. He'd been balancing work, hospital visits, and family responsibilities almost entirely alone. Suddenly, the story in my head collapsed. Nothing about his behavior had changed. Only my understanding had. That moment taught me the seventh psychological trick. The most powerful influence often comes from assumptions, not reality. Assumptions shape how we interpret people, how we judge intentions, how we assign meaning. And sometimes those assumptions are completely wrong. That realization bothered me. For weeks, I thought about how many people I'd misunderstood, how many situations I'd misread, how many conclusions I'd reached with incomplete information. The deeper I looked into psychology, the more I noticed a pattern. Most influence doesn't happen through force. It happens through perception, through attention, through expectations, through emotional understanding, through the stories people tell themselves. The strange thing is that none of these psychological tricks require manipulation. In fact, the people who use them most effectively often aren't trying to control anyone at all. They're simply aware. Aware of emotions. Aware of human behavior. Aware of how people think. And awareness creates influence. I eventually stopped viewing psychology as a collection of tricks. I started seeing it as a mirror. A way to understand both others and myself. Because every lesson I learned about influence revealed something uncomfortable about my own mind too. I discovered how often I rushed to judgment. How easily expectations shaped my perceptions. How much I wanted to be heard instead of listening. How frequently I confused confidence with truth. Those discoveries weren't always pleasant. But they were valuable. Today, whenever I meet someone difficult, I try to remember that there may be a story I can't see. Whenever I feel certain about someone's intentions, I remind myself that certainty can be misleading. Whenever I enter a disagreement, I focus less on winning and more on understanding. And surprisingly, that approach often creates more influence than any technique ever could. Because the greatest psychological insight isn't learning how to control minds. It's realizing how often our own minds are being guided by invisible assumptions. The people around us aren't just responding to facts. They're responding to perceptions. So are we. And maybe that's the hidden truth most people never notice. Every day, we influence each other through silence, attention, expectations, empathy, and assumptions. Not because we're manipulating one another. Because that's simply how human psychology works. And once you begin to see it, you start noticing it everywhere. In conversations. In relationships. In workplaces. In yourself. The question is no longer whether minds are being influenced. The real question is, how many of your decisions are truly yours, and how many were shaped by perceptions you never stopped to examine?